Hello, everyone who's here in person. Thank you for bearing with us. It's very rare, I guess, that there aren't technical difficulties these days, but I'm excited to be here and to talk about classics and how they're being updated and retold and reimagined. I guess I'll start with my PowerPoint, which I will share, which if we leave that on, then you can all see the PowerPoint. Oh, okay. I do have a lot of pictures and stuff in there. Going to screen share so you can see my PowerPoint that I put together. And that looks good. And I full screen it here. There. So, and I'm out of the way. Good. Revisiting, reconsidering, and classics with young readers. When I put together this pitch, didn't know for sure what age I was going to be focusing on. So it ended up a lot of a focus on 12 and up, so for teens, although there's many different lower middle grade, which is for 8, 12, and retellings and things that are available for them. Not as many retellings, obviously, I think for obvious reasons. There are children's classes necessarily need to be retold in quite the same way. So if anyone wants for middle grade or younger, I'm happy to do that, but this will focus mostly on teens. So about me, I was born in Alpena. I moved away for a long time. I went away. I studied education and marketing and then ended up majoring in English because I knew that I really wanted to do something with books. And what I thought I wanted to do was going to, but soon I found out that what I actually love to do is just connect people with books the way that I can. And while publishing is big and exciting, I love person-to-person interactions and actually handing a book to a kid that never would have found on their own. And it's the books that makes them love reading. And I think one of the things that happens is that, especially in school, for many different reasons, sometimes because of lack of, sometimes because teachers are very overwhelmed. They have so much going on. So they classics and things that they've done for years because they have the materials and they have no support financially or sometimes from their administration. So not blaming teachers. There's a lot of reasons why we use good reasons and bad. And I think that, so we give kids classics at a young age that just kind of overwhelm them and end up stifling of reading, even though it is a good book or has merits. So that's kind of what I dive into today. So I just want to start out with a general definition that classic is a work of art of recognized and established value. So that can mean a lot, right? So to generally agreed upon as a classic, works meet some common standards for quality. They have longevity and influence. It's also, classics are often considered an expression of life, truth, and beauty, of quality for the time that it was written, at least. Different styles, but classics will be appreciated for their construction and literary art. And they might not be a bestseller today unless they end up on a class curriculum or something like that. And then also people often say that classics touch readers to their very, partly because they integrate themes that are understood from a wide range of backgrounds and levels of experience. It's said that you can read classics and characters and situations despite the difference in era. And it's classic can alter your view to see how little has changed in our basic human makeup. And I think there are things that are very good about that and also things that are very bad because things do change, stay the same. And because books do reflect the time in which they were written, a lot of therefore have carried forward very sometimes harmful things or things that were applicable in addition to the things that are good about them. So what do we do? Well, or what do we think about of the pitfalls of the classics? So classics generally refer to the, at least when we talk about them in the US. They consider who was writing these books that have become classics because of their longevity or because they're often because of these common themes. who had the resources to write them, the support to write them. Were even allowed to be given a platform. Themes of love, hate, death, life, and faith touch on some of our most basic emotional responses, can be understood by a wide range of backgrounds and levels of experience. That's true. But the characterization, the setting, and the way the book understands and comments on the world and life will always be limited to experiences, no matter who they are, even if it's even as the brought to life by that author's hand. So classics, like any piece of art, show one perspective. Relying completely on the canon to impart universal themes is always going to be limiting. So what is a retelling, a reimagining, or a remix? It's pretty much, it's a new version of a familiar tale. Writers will often ground the story from literature, film, or theater, contemporary or a different time period than the original, to touch on the original writer may not have been able to. And writers often intentionally subvert their source through the lens of gender, race, and sexuality. So I wanted to also share this quote from an editor of a new series of, they're called Classics Reimagined, I believe. Classics is what they're calling them. So there's 4 of them out so far. Interview about why they were relaunching these and remixing these classics. The editor that there are so many so-called classics that have been held up for generations as the excellence, but why? These classics are widely thought to accurately depict real. That's simply not true. It's even more harmful to teach it as such to young people. What do these new books bring to the original texts? If anything, a much needed, long overdue reality. And so Settle also mentions that she hopes the series serves as a Trojan horse of sorts, engaging reads and an alternative to some classics, and to challenge the notion of what even means. So I will be touching on those 4 books in this. I also think it's important to realize that how in the past, only certain people were able to publish and tell their story if they were telling stories of other people. That has largely continued in ways today. Graph shows from 2019 shows a spread of characters in U.S. children's literature, and you'll see that 41.8% of books still star white main characters, 29.2% or aliens or something like that. Only 11.9% star characters Black or African American or African. Only 1% star character or First Nations. 5.3% star character Latinx, and 8.7% that are Asian American, and only 5% are starring characters that are Pacific Islanders. So I share this because I feel like it's important even now, even if you feel like you're seeing these really, like, everything seems diverse, every book seems to be about queer characters or Black characters or that. I think sometimes as white people, we you can only see your own experience, so you don't often notice or understand when you see these things that they're not the norm. They just pop out as different to you. Reason that that's happening, and still those books underpublished. And even in this graph, it doesn't go into that detail, but stories about people who are Black, Native, Latinx, or Asian, or Pacific Islander being told by white authors. And of course, anyone can write what they want. Again, you can only write from your own experience, truly. Even if you have and people who are giving you feedback, you're still writing from your experience. So I think that's keep in mind as we start going through this, and to keep in mind as you read generally that be intentional about what you're reading, because most things you will find are still going to just your experience back to you. So the first one I wanted to talk about, one of the Classics Remixed. So this is a retelling of Robin Hood. It's called Travelers Along the Way. There's a little bit of a blurb about what it's about, and I also age. I will note that on any of these, when you see the age, anything that's full is usually a clue that it might have sexual content in it. So for any young adult book, 14 and up, that's usually why. That can be helpful when you're shopping. So this one, I have a quote from the author and why she decided to retell this. So said that she grew up on Disney's Fox version of Robin Hood, who made her feel like being the funniest and the most willing to not give up with what made you heroic. All good things, right? So as she learned more about the history of the Crusades, the hero's story became increasingly for her. She said, I'm a Muslim woman, and Robin was, since the 19th century, has canonically been a crusader. He's someone who is deeply invested in the status quo and to rob the rich to give to the poor because he wants his own ancestral lands back. By taking the mind of a crusader and turning that into the story of a young Muslim woman who's fighting to protect her homeland from invaders and her own region's fragile peace, I can also reclaim a piece of history. The medieval world was incredibly diverse and incredibly global. We all deserve to be able. And I think this also speaks to how we often take classic literature, oh, well, it's just a reflection of our past, but our past was very diverse. It just happened in literature. And so some of these retellings and remixes go back and inject things that were really happening during the time period of the original classics. The retelling of Robin Hood that recently came out is Ivory Key. This one is an Indian-inspired Robin Hood with magic as a prized resource. So it's fantasy, which is obviously from the original Robin Hood. This is another of the remixes. It's called Clash of Steel. It's a retelling of Treasure Island. In this one, I also have a quote from the author that what she's always loved about Treasure Island, and I want to start from the beginning. She said, I'm excited to be working with the spirit of adventure and discovery about Treasure Island and bringing it to the South China Sea with a courageous girl at the forefront. There's more that you can read. This slideshow will be available, of course, but her goals in revisiting, she explained, is to explore how outcasts of history, people who would choose rather than be part of society that did not want them, to find family and form communities in their time. What would freedom mean for a young queer girl in the 1800s? What treasure would she steer? In this exploration of Treasure Island, Lee wanted to bring human connection. Another that's coming out in the series is this retelling of Wuthering Heights. So a lot of similarities here. However, the author wanted to focus on that British was colonized by India, and white men traveled there and had children with Indian women. If the children passed as white, they were then sent back to England to be integrated into proper white society. And the author had a plan for weaving that little known part of history into this retelling. So that element is added into this remix. To read from her. And then this fourth remix is called So Many Beginnings. It's a retelling of Little Women, and it follows 4 young Black during the Civil War. For anyone who's read Little Women, it's one of the books that I loved and still enjoy. It's set during the Civil War, but people in that novel is kind of odd. So this story is from the perspective of 4 young women who are all Black in the Roanoke colony. And the author, Bethany, said, this series is for those of us who know and love stories that didn't reflect our marginalized and who want to correct that. So she decided to set her novel at the Freedmen's Colony Island in 1863, at a time when some of the residents were emancipated or not. And she also notes here how there are many retellings of Little Women, and I've seen one that didn't have a white cast. So that this one is notable for that reason. We have other Little Women retellings, including Great or Nothing. This is written by 4 together. And I love this one because each author is telling the perspective of a different sister. And this book takes place after Meg, the angel of the house, of course, has died. So perspective is still represented, but in poetry, as kind of watching over her three sisters with them after her death. And the other thing that's great about this one is that it's been moved from the war era to World War II era. So each of the sisters is given a lot more to kind of explore what grief means. It's set, of course, during World War II when a lot of women were able to get jobs, and sometimes the first time or the first recognized time. So I think that one's a great one this week. This one, Joe and Laurie, by Margaret Melissa de la Cruz, is another Little Women retelling. And this one is something that does a teen, because in this one, Laurie does Joe, and she does say no, as per the book, but then she has a change of heart. And so it kind of follows what could have happened. This retelling is of Romeo and Juliet. There's lots of Shakespeare retelling. Waking Romeo is a genre-bending retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Includes time travel. There's a little bit about that. But I also wanted to touch on a quote from the where she says that her work, she considers her work in conversation source texts. Writers are realizing that classic works are a rich vein to tap into. If you want to comment on race or gender or issues of social justice that are teens, what better way to do so than to have it set against something that we understand as a retellings are interesting because they are a barometer of where society is moving. Another Romeo and Juliet has recently been released is An Arrow to the Moon. Actually, I think this one, no, yeah, I think it comes out in April. So this one is Romeo and Juliet infused with mythology. And of course, there are two star-crossed lovers. And also this retelling of Romeo and Juliet, These Violent Delights. This is a duology. Two books, they're both out. And this is set in 1920s Shanghai, rival gangs and a monster in the depths of the river. Then we move into Pride and Prejudice retellings. I love Pride and Prejudice, but for some teens especially, it can be a little dense to get into. There are many other books that kind of touch on the same themes. So one new one, Meeting Darcy. This is a contemporary retelling of Pride and Prejudice, starring each competitors. So they're in speech or debate and go to a private I think the cover pretty much communicates the relationship between Liz and then here I wanted to mention oh yes, West Side Story. Yep, absolutely. So here Dasgupta says that the thing that draws her to the humor and her ability to be witty and dry and poke at social conventions and do social and so she wanted to do the same thing, which is why this book includes a Me Too movement, because Dasgupta says that rereading and rewriting is a dynamic process, especially for marginalized creators. The reading experience is the text, she says. It's the space created between the text and the reader. The space has to be by the reader's life and the reader's perspective. When you do a retelling, you're entering that liminal and creating a new shape, making new bridges between the original text and your own life. And she also mentions here that in the book, explicitly addresses questions of representation and reimagining in the text itself, because this is a retelling. So the character in the book likes Pride and Prejudice and has to kind of examine what that means to her as an Indian person. Another Pride and Prejudice retelling is Ibby's a Boy. This is it's a romance and it's place in Brooklyn as it's being gentrified, Bushwick. Let's see, what other ones do we have? Oh, Pride and Prejudice, Pride and Premeditation. This history retelling of Pride and Prejudice. It was written by a friend of mine, actually, who's a Michigan native. And there's a second, just about to be out, called Sense and the play on Sense and Sensibility, but it's another in the series. There will be 3 in the series, and they're all plays on Austen novels. So those are fun. And then also First and Then by this is Pride and Prejudice meets Friday Night Lights. So even more contemporary, very realistic high school setting. And then this is another take, Bennett. So this is about a 17-year-old girl who wants to be like Elizabeth Bennet, but a lot more like the younger sister, Mary Bennett, the one that's always playing piano. Elsie. No, I missed it. Let's see here. Elementary classics. I need to know what you mean, because I have definitely versions, not in the slideshow, but younger versions of the classics that can be read, that versions. But then there are also some books that are good read alouds, depending on the age, that are middle grade retellings as well. So maybe that's something that we can touch base about after, Melody, and I can specifically. Okay, let me minimize the screen to this. Oh, there we go. And then this one is a retell, Emma. And so this one is 14 and up again. So of course there's more likely one, and there is sex in this one. So this is an LGBTQ retelling of Jane Austen's Emma. And the main character is a college freshman. Wood mentions that she drew inspiration from Jane Austen's Emma, Amy Heckerling's adaptation, Clueless. I guess maybe not everyone knows that Clueless is an Emma, and her experience at Emerson College in Boston, and called this book a sex-positive romp through freshman college life, featuring a queer cast. And Wood said, I like characters who are a bit messy. Emma and Elliot are similar in that they're women well, but don't always do well, which I think sums up Emma pretty perfectly. This retelling, My Fine Fellow, is a retelling of Pygmalion / the adaptation of Pygmalion. So this gender-bent young adult take on My Fair punchy, clever, and has a focus on food. There's romance, and it's still set during the Victorian era. So it's like Bridgerton or Dickinson. And the author, she wanted to switch the genders focused on in Pygmalion. This one, of course, there's a boy who's being remade into a is very much a product of its time. And I wanted to deal with some modern issues on top that there already were. I wanted to deal with anti-Semitism and feminism because things that are cropping up again or that never go away. These are things I've dealt with in my own, a lot of young people still do. And she also talks a little bit about novel and being upfront that some things are true and some things have been for the sake of the story and that kind of thing. I wanted to mention within these wicked walls, a retelling of Jane Eyre. This one is cool because it's an Ethiopian-inspired fantasy retelling of Jane Eyre. And the main character is an exorcist hired to cleanse the of the evil eye. And then, of course, there is a handsome young heir that comes into the picture, terrifying manifestations at every turn. And then the author book that Western literature, often the backbone of U.S. high school English course, a remake this season. Okay, so she didn't write that part. I didn't mean to put that in there. But said, I wanted to do my best to nod to the very important scenes in the original text, but also her Jamaican American upbringing also allows her to look at the text through a post-colonial lens. A person of color being this crazy woman up in the attic and a villain of the whole thing. It's not about the Black characters are the heroes. I chose Ethiopia as my inspiration, not folklore, but because the country was never colonized. And then also another play retelling. So our Thornton Wilder has been retold in You'd Be Home by Now by Kathleen Glasgow. This one also deals with the opioid crisis, which my last presentation I talked about some that tackle that as well. And then a couple of Frankenstein. This graphic novel just came out. So this is set in Mexico, where Christina Franco, an apprentice shaman, is killed by witch owls, and her Enrique cannot let her go. With forbidden alchemy and engineering, Enrique brings her back to life, human heart machine. And so this will be a trilogy, I think, or 8 volumes, I think a trilogy. This other retelling of Frankenstein was written by Lee, and it's set in an alternate world where Frankenstein is being written by a young woman as these things are unfolding. It's the story of, well, Mary Shelley, of course, is the young woman, and her friends Alistair and Oliver, who are brothers. So when something tragic happens between, it inspires Frankenstein. And then also Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which is reimagining of Frankenstein, but from the point of view of Elizabeth Lavenza, who is supposed to be kind of the ward of the Frankenstein. So she grows up being best friends with Frankenstein until things take a dark and dangerous turn. And then I also wanted to include some short stories. So this one is Hideous Heart. This is a collection of 13 short stories that have been reimagined. Dahlia Adler has done a couple collections that are reimagining. She has one that's also all reimaginings of Shakespeare stories, and then forthcoming, but I can't remember what the focus is right now. Not out yet. So this one though is all retellings of Poe stories, and Adler said most of Poe's stories, for example, feature white male narrators, but there are no white male narrators in his Hideous Heart. An anthology works well to make them feel more relevant to a modern audience while showing how you can work creatively with text. Hopes that educators embrace this new collection, because there are some kids who are always going to struggle because it isn't accessible and relevant. He believes these retellings can help and allow readers of all experiences to feel seen. And I didn't have this, I will add it in just from something that I wrote. I forgot to put that in. Of course, most of these books are available at Eyre. Maybe not every single one. Many of them are available in the young adult, which adults are very much allowed to come into and browse. You just can't hang out in there. It's specifically for 12 to 18. It's their space. But if you would like to buy any of these or gift them to anyone, I highly recommend shopping at Parallel 45 Books and Gifts in downtown Alpena. Bookshop, which is an online platform that's meant to challenge Amazon. And a portion of everything purchased on the website goes back to independent bookstores, and typically choose your local bookstore for that percentage to go back to. And then they get to basically hit every month. So you're still supporting them, even if you're not in person. And then Libro FM, I would say better alternative to Kindle, or not Audible. Libro FM, you can get many different audiobooks on. Percentage of the money goes back to small independent businesses, and buy audiobooks on Libro FM, you actually own them, whereas on Audible, you're just renting them. So that is all that. And then I have some of my sources, and the story that I wrote that I didn't add in here. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Last time I went over so much that I shortened it this time, and maybe too much even with our delay. Yes, so anyone have any questions? I see
have a
the elementary
comment.
classics.
I have a comment about the artwork on the book covers. It's a delight just to see that part of it. Plus, see your face, Sarah.
Thank you, Jo. I think I wanted to pull, there are some very beautiful covers of classics, and they're usually more expensive and hardcover, and they're sometimes, so I specifically pulled covers of classics that when I bought when I was in high school or in college reading these classics, because they're and they're so unappealing. And I think it really highlights too that there is nothing wrong with reading stories from the perspective of, people who are wrong with that. I just think that we should diversify. And when you look at those covers of the classic, all very sad looking white women, pretty much. So when you put that right next to of the new classics, you can see why they're so engaging to teens and how they can, as a jumping off point to then read the classics, or, if they're get through the classics, they just don't get why this matters, why they have to read it. These contemporary retellings, they'll find the beats in there. The themes are still there. They'll find messages, and they might even go on to read the classic to see how it changed, because compare those things. I also love handing, like for a Christmas gift or a birthday gift or some holiday, a copy of a classic, especially a really pretty, nice, and a couple retellings as well. And then saying, you have that relationship with the kids and teens in your life, let's read these together and talk about and why I might have loved this book when I read it as a teen, or why I hated it when I read it as a teen. It didn't speak to me. So I think as I get older, I appreciate classics in new ways, but I feel very lucky that I was already considered myself a reader. So even when I was struggling with a classic, it didn't make me stop. Right, I still kept going, but for so many teens and kids, don't. And that just makes me so sad, because we can address these same themes, these things, stories universal, but through a much more relevant and impactful setting and characters. And some classics do not either. Many of them do. Many of them have parts that age well, but I think it's important to be critical and not just say, well, this is just what we've always used or what. Any other questions from anyone?
Hi, Sarah. This is Olin. Very nice job of presenting some stuff that I didn't really know was out there. So congratulations. My question is, are any of the books that you featured graphic novels? And any comments that you might have about that trend? And just one autobiographical element. When I was a boy, there was a great comic book series that we now call graphic novels, called Classics Illustrated. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of those. They're 50 or 60 years old now, but they were wonderful and were in some cases gateways for my brothers and me to read the books that they were summarizing in those ways that was really lively for me when I was 8 or 10 or 12 years old.
Absolutely. So what's your first question about which ones are and other graphic novels too? Is that what you asked? Anecdote?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. Before Joe, which I do have something to comment on that, but did you ask about graphic novel retellings as well and other options? Is that what the question was?
Well, the basic question is, are any of the books that you showed us today done in graphic novel format?
So the only one in the slideshow that was a graphic novel was the telling of Frankenstein that was by Raoul III and David. However, I was coming today specifically with very different, but there are manga and graphic novel of many of the classics now. And I will say that those get checked out all the time by teens and middle grade students in the library, because we have many library shelves. and they pick them up unprompted. So they are interested in some of those stories, and then they do love manga and graphic novels. I never started reading graphic novels until I took a class in college where I had an assigned graphic, and then I fell in love with the format. I could not believe that you could have this book that was, and you could finish it and have that same satisfying feeling as when you read a whole novel. They're amazing. They do give you all of that. And they're, as many people, grandkids and kids, you read them over and over again and find all these other details. So I'm a huge proponent and fan of graphic novels. And while I didn't on it in this presentation, because I was mostly focusing on the classics as things that you would study in school, there are so many great graphic novel retellings and just versions of, what would I call them, like fairy tales and Greek myths. And so like Cinderella, The Little Mermaid, Peter Pan, like all of these stories, there's really good retellings of those, and many of them are graphic novels. There's also like deep dives into Greek heroes and things like that, and each of them has a graphic novel. O'Connor has a series like that that's good for middle grade and young adult. But there's a lot of things like that, and I would absolutely be happy to put together suggestions for that, and of just really great graphic novels. Olin and Alpena, for any reason, or just anyone wants to stop in, we have greatly our graphic novel section at the library. Now it's its own full row, has new books. Oh yes, I would do a presentation with lots of interior images. So fun. Yes, I just love graphic novels. I think people, they worry that if their kids are just graphic novels and just devouring them so quickly, right? They feel like they're not getting the same impact because it's going, but that's absolutely not true. And many text and words in graphic novels are at a higher level than children's novels, and people don't realize that. So the language that is there is at a higher level, and they are engaging with it more because they're invested in the story and the format. Also, I think we know how important visual literacy is now, being able to interpret images and follow a story in that way. So it's also useful just on its own. Let me see.
Thank you, Sarah. Well done.
Thank you. Just want to see if there's any other thing. Oh, but I don't see a question there. Just a thank you. Is there a question up above? No. I don't know if you had more to say there, Joy, at the end if it got cut off. Okay. So as you might guess, I'm in favor of encouraging young people to read, but I don't know yet how I feel about actually labeling titles as retelling. I hope young people still will read them. Absolutely. And I think that they will. I think that especially, they're never in schools, and a lot of classics are still very good, even if there are problematic of them. So for example, I love Peter Pan in a lot of ways, loving that story, but the way that Indigenous and Native people are in that book, and the fact that Peter Pan is basically kidnapping children in the night and taking the island, is maybe a little bit weird. So recently, was to suspend disbelief. That's kind of the point. But our middle grade book, 8 to 12, we just read a retelling of Peter Pan in that club. called Sisters of the Never Sea. And that one was from the point of view of a girl who was Black and Indigenous. And in the story, her sister and her stolen away, and she goes to rescue them, and ends up kind of some other Indigenous people on the island who tell her that, you know, in this story, Peter Pan is, they become the heroes, and the kids really liked it. Even and retelling, but so I think that's absolutely. Now we're open to the so melody that we'll get some recommendations for you. You email me my information. My email is on the PowerPoint that will go out. So I think just ahead. But okay, well, I guess that's all from me. If no one has any. Oh, Joe Dean said, what will your June subject be? I asked if this was okay, but I asked my my coworker and assistant director to join me for that presentation. And so we're going to be putting together reads that have come out in the last couple of years that would be, we think, a good summer, which doesn't necessarily mean a beach read. We're going to define it in a few ways. And I'm going to keep focusing on youth books for youth that I think would cross over well for adults. And Jessica is adult titles. And then, well, maybe she might do some kids titles and I'll do some adult, because we do read all types of books. So that's our plan. Everyone for being here, for bearing with us on this.